Welcome to the Crunch McDabble Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show where we break down your Pathfinder 2nd Edition rules into delightful character building moments. Today's show, persistent damage. So here are the basics. The general rules for persistent damage. As we already said, the monster doesn't take the persistent damage when you hit it. Instead, it takes it at the end of its turn. So on your turn, you're going to deal out the persistent damage. At that point, the monster has persistent damage, but it won't actually take the damage until the end of its turn. Then on the monster's turn, after they've made all their actions, then they take the damage, and then after that, they're going to make a DC 15 flat check to see if they shake it, or if they're still affected by it. And there we go. So as far as stacking the persistent damage, the same types of persistent damage won't stack. You just take the higher amount. So if you have bleeding damage from two different sources, it won't stack, it just take the higher amount. But different sources do stack, and each unique condition would garner its own flat check. So it doesn't say that specifically in the rules, but it does say this. I found this at the end of your turn section. It says after you've taken flat checks, plural, to end persistent damage. So the plural there, it seems to indicate to me that for better or for worse, multiple persistent damages are going to stack, and each one's going to garner its own flat check. Another thing about persistent damage, and I think this is the most important part, the best part, persistent damage, sometimes it doubles on a critical hit or a critical saving throw failure. Don't forget this, because this is a huge part of this. Now, it doesn't always double. It depends on where you're getting the bonus from. Any bonus you get that is specifically for a critical hit, like the persistent fire damage on a flaming rune, that example is actually in the core rulebook. That damage, it's not going to get doubled. It's just on critical hits. Because you can see the damage is already the result of a critical hit. But if it isn't specific to a critical hit, in other words, if the persistent damage is part of the regular damage that you get just on a hit, then on a critical hit, it's going to get doubled. So look at these acid flasks that your friendly alchemist can make. And this is another example that's in the book. They deal almost no damage on a hit, but they deal a d6 acid damage on a hit. And they also deal splash damage. Now the persistent acid damage, it's just on a hit, on any hit. So when you hit with a critical hit with that bomb, it's going to double that persistent damage. So that's going to be great. We're going to take all that into account. And finally, the last part of this, you can, or the monsters can, spend actions to get rid of the persistent damage. Generally, this is 2 actions. Someone else can help you out with this too, so they can use their actions to help you. But most monsters, they're not going to usually do this unless it's really obvious, like they're on fire and there's a lake right there. But either way, even if they do use up their actions, it's going to use up their actions, which is still a win for us, so we like that. Okay, let's look at some persistent damage. To start off with, there are a bunch of persistent damages that go off on critical hits. So this is probably the least reliable because you have to crit to get it. The weapon critical specialization effects for knives and darts, for example, they both deal persistent bleed damage. And it's a nice amount. I like this. It's a d6. That's not bad. And you can add in the item bonus of the weapon too, which is also nice. And a grievous rune on a dart, it's going to increase that dart's critical specialization effect to 2d6 plus the item bonus in bleed damage, and that's great. But you don't get weapon specialization effects until, well, it varies. A Paladin could get it at level 3 with the Blade Spirit ally, or some get it at level 5, some level 7, some don't even get it at all. It all depends on your class. But that's not a bad source of persistent damage. We'll tuck that one away. I like that one. A whole bevy of ancestries get persistent damage at level 9 on their unarmed attacks. It's only a d4 damage, and it's only on criticals, but there are some interesting types of damage. For example, the changeling deals mental damage, and the catfolk deals poison damage because their claws are super dirty, I guess. And then the orc and the dampier, they deal bleed damage. The kobold has a nice one for ancestries. If you're a venom-tailed kobold, once a day you can use your tail to poison your piercing or slashing weapon, and it deals the persistent damage just on a hit, which is even nicer. And you get this at first level. It's only an amount of damage equal to your level, which isn't much, and it's only once a day. And at level 9, you can make it twice a day. But I still like this one. It's a unique type. It's just on a hit. It's at first level, but it's only once a day. The Investigator has a neat one too. Scalpel's Point at level 4. If you're a forensic medicine investigator, if that's the kind of investigator you are, you use a devise a stratagem, and if you hit, you can deal a 1d6 persistent bleed damage on top of your damage. So you get that at 4th level. That's pretty early on. I like that. It's like you study the target and figure out just where to slice them, and with your knowledge of anatomy, you got them open. It works pretty good. It's a decent amount of damage. You get it pretty early on at 4th level. So I like that one. It's pretty good. A bunch of spells are going to deal extra persistent damage when you nail them with a critical hit with the spell, or if they fail a critical failure on the saving throw. Produce Flame, for example, it's an attack cantrip that deals 1d4 persistent fire damage on a crit. And many of these, like Produce Flame, they can be heightened, increasing that amount of persistent damage when you heighten it, which is real nice. There are several spells, and a bunch of these are 2nd level spells, and they deal really, really good amounts of persistent damage, and they can be heightened, but they have a saving throw, and if the target critically succeeds at the saving throw, they don't take any damage, and if they make the saving throw, they take half the persistent damage. Some examples are Phantom Pain, Fungal Infestation, and Blistering Invective. I love that name. All of these are level 2 examples. They're nice, they deal good amounts of persistent damage, but there is that chance that the target critically succeeds and nothing happens. The great thing about these, though, is they can be heightened, adding more and more damage and persistent damage, but you just run the risk of that monster with the high saves just ignoring the damage, and you wasted your actions. A really good one is the Dual Weapon Warriors archetype. They have an 8th level feat called Flensing Slice. It's a single action that you would have to use after you made a double slice. So right now we're assuming that you have all 3 actions, a full round of attacks that you're dedicating to this. And you don't have to move or you don't have to do anything else. You have to use all your attacks for this, but it's nice. The tricky part about it too, there's another tricky part. You have to hit twice with your double slice, which is, it's kind of tough to rely on. It's going to happen, but not every time. But there's a ton of upside to this. For one, the damage is really, really, really oozy. 1d8 per weapon damage dice on whichever weapon you're wielding that is higher. So this is going to be at least 2d8 right when you get this feat. And you can go as high as 4d8 at level 19. And it decreases their resistances by lowering any physical resistance DR they have by 5. And it makes them flat-footed, which is all great for someone else, because both of these disappear at the start of your next turn. But that bleed damage, that lingers on. It lingers long after the flash of your blades, it lingers on. The Rogue is really great with bleed persistent damage, but their attacks have to hit a flat-footed target. Now this isn't the hardest thing at all to generate, but it's still a requirement. To begin with, because they deal sneak attack damage, they can use this consumable called a Bloodseeker's Beak and add in a d4 persistent bleed damage on a hit against a flat-footed target, and at level 6 they get Twist the Knife. I like feats like this because it's like the Flensing Slice. It adds damage without an attack. It's a single action. If your last action was an attack that dealt sneak attack damage, spend an action and add some persistent bleed damage to it. Now it's only an amount equal to the number of sneak attack dice, so it's not a huge amount. So it's going to be 2 when you get this feat, and 3 at level 11, and 4 at 17th level. But it is auto damage, which is super nice. Instead of a third attack at minus 65 or whatever that map is, slap in one of these. I like Twist the Knife. And then at level 12, the Rogue blows up persistent damage. Level 12 seems to be the benchmark when characters start getting good at this. They get the Bloody Debilitations feat. You got debilitations at level 9. Now you add this feat in at level 12. All you have to do is just hit a flat-footed target. They have to be flat-footed. That could be tricky, but it's not too hard. And you can give them 3d6 bleed damage just on a hit. That's 10.5 average damage they're going to take at the end of their turn. That's super nice. Don't forget, that's going to double on a crit too. So at level 12, the Rogue finds itself in the elite status for persistent damage. It is bleed damage, which is pretty common, but this is still great. Next come the abilities where all you have to do is hit, not even hit a flat-footed target like the Rogue. Now these go off just on a hit, which is going to be even more common. And there are spells like Shocking Grasp and Acid Arrow, two classic spells. Well, Shocking Grasp is only if they're wearing metal armor, but that's going to happen a lot. These are great low-level spells, and Acid Arrow is going to pour in that acid persistent damage, and you can heighten it up too. So really, that's going to be a nice one. And there are a bunch of great items that land right in here. Acid Flasks, we looked at that one. The best part about these, it's a level 1 item. They're cheap. So even if you don't have a friendly alchemist in your party, you can probably buy these. And if you do have an alchemist, they can just make a ton of these and spam them out there. And they get even better with some alchemist feats. At level 8 with Sticky Bomb, they add in splash damage, now dealing 2d6 plus that 2 persistent acid damage, which is nice. It's adding to that persistent damage. And then at level 11, when the bomb level increases, this increases to 3d6 plus 3 persistent acid damage, which is nice too. And don't forget, the most important part is on a crit, all that's doubled. So at level 11, it's 13.5 persistent acid damage on average. And a crit hits for 27 average persistent damage. That can't be right. That seems really high. But here it is, the real gem for the persistent damage. I like this one. It's a wounding rune. It's a level 7 item. It adds in bleed damage on every hit, and it's 1d6 persistent bleed damage, which is a pretty good amount. And that increases to 1d12 on a critical hit. Is it 1d12 or 2d6? Whatever it is. So if you're looking for a great way to add some persistent bleed damage, look no further than this one. So one other item here. I like this one, the Bastard Sword for that Regathiel Paladin we love so much. It can turn the bleed damage and make it work against undead. So I'd take one of those all day and all night. And as long as we're looking at items, I like this one too. The Bloodletter Kukri. Turn those D6s bleed damage into D8 bleed damage. Yep. And Kukris are great weapons. It's a D6 agile finesse weapon plus trip. This is a great one. Plus it's visually amazing. We move on to the monk, and they are real good at the persistent damage dealing. They start off slow. At first level, they could take the Tiger Stance feat and deal in 1d4 persistent bleed damage, but it's just on critical hits. So nothing too great there, except that it is at first level, which is real nice. And at level 6, this increases pretty greatly. In the same Tiger Stance, you can now add your strength modifier to that persistent damage, meaning you're looking at 1d6 plus 4 probably, which is really, really nice at level 6. That's pretty early for this. And then at level 10, if you want your monk to mix it up and mix up stances because you're tired of dealing only the persistent damage on crits, go into a Cobra stance. And you can add 5-foot reach to your attack with a single action and use Cobra and Venom, an attack that deals 1d4 persistent poison damage per weapon die. So it's a fairly unique type of persistent damage, and it's a decent amount. It's 1d4 per weapon die, so that's pretty good. And the downside is it's only once a minute, which is not that good. So once a combat, basically. Otherwise, this one would be awesome. But the monk does get to awesome status with the persistent damage at level 12 when everybody else does, with the feat Disrupt Ki or Kai. However you want to pronounce that. It's that void strike attack type of attack. It deals persistent damage on a hit, which is great. Just a hit, not a crit now. There's no limitation to how often you can use it. It is 2 actions, so it's going to only be once a round, more or less. But it does deal 2d6 persistent negative damage, which is nice because it's extremely unique. I didn't see any other persistent negative damage. Maybe it's out there. I didn't see it. And it makes the target enfeebled 1. On top of that, this is a great attack. Plus you deal your regular damage on that hit. And remember, if you critically hit with your attack, you double the persistent damage. So it will be 4d6 persistent damage. Now it only works against a living target, so that's a little bit of a drawback. But otherwise, this one's great. Our next heavy hitter, the Druid. Well, the Wild Druid. They can go into a beast form, and at level 11, so this is a little better because it's one level earlier, they deal out 2d6 persistent bleed damage on a claw attack or 2d6 persistent poison damage on a jaw attack. The poison damage is nice. It's a little unique because it would stack with the easier to find bleed damage, so that's good. But since these are unarmed attacks, You can't stack in a Grievous rune on your hand wraps. It's the same with the rogue too. They can't do this. It's a little unfortunate. You can't get that done, but it is going to be that 2d6 persistent damage on a hit. It's nice, and if these crit, you're doubling that, so potentially on an amazing round, you could be dropping in 46 persistent damage. That's going to be 14 persistent damage average, and the best part about this, it's available at level 11, which is one round earlier than the rest of those higher end abilities, so that's pretty amazing. And then comes the doozy. This one's so fantastic. It's amazing because you get this right at first level. I think I'm going to sneeze, so hang on, bear with me. The Fire Oracle. When they release their incendiary aura, the focus spell, they can pretty much drop that focus spell every single combat. Every single combat. Now, all you have to do is hit the target with fire damage, and they're going to take 2d4 persistent fire damage. Now, that's the hard part, right? Because you got to hit them with fire after this, and there's no guarantee there because hitting is hard, and especially when you need to hit. And who has fire damage? And you know how it always goes, because every time you need to hit, that's when you miss. Except, wait, there's Alchemist Fire. The first level Alchemist Fire, it deals splash fire damage even on a miss. So you drop an incendiary aura and then follow it up with the Alchemist Fire, lob that in there, and watch the enemies burst into flames. So you could build a first level Elf Oracle with the Alchemist archetype and just burn everything to death in one round, right at first level. It's a one-man wrecking crew or a one-elf wrecking crew. You add in some feats to increase the splash range, and as you heighten the incendiary aura, the aura range increases. This is going to get ridiculous, and it all starts right at first level. And we saved my favorite for last, a Paladin making a retributive strike, and any of the champion abilities that add in the good damage, they could work kind of with this, but the Paladin's a little better for, you'll see. If they have a good charisma, and if they have a Spirit Blade ally that they choose at 3rd level, and if they have the 10th level feat, Radiant Blade Spirit, the feat that adds in a certain kind of rune, and if you add in a Flaming rune, remember that does the D10 damage, fire damage persistent on a crit, and just on your regular weapon, you attach in a Wounding rune, and now you do that at 7th level. Now, when they make their big retributive strike, or at level 12, when they make a Blade of Justice attack with the Greater Striking Bastard Sword, they would deal in 3d12 plus 5 slashing damage just on the hit, and then there'd be the 1d6 fire damage with that, plus it would add in the 4 persistent good damage, plus 1d6 persistent bleed damage. But then, on that crit, if you crit on that attack, things just go berserk from there. You double the persistent good damage, you increase the bleed damage to 2d6 or 1d12, whatever it is, and then you add in that 1d10 of persistent fire damage. That's going to be 20 average persistent damage on a crit, all from 3 sources. So that's a pretty rough number to beat. I guess the Alchemist did beat it, but on a crit. But it's going to turn your Paladin into this a monster beater with persistent damage. And the Paladin's a surprise upset. I guess it didn't win the persistent damage Olympics, but it was pretty good. I like the Paladin a lot. And that is it. I've been your host, Crunch McDabbles. This has been the Crunch McDabbles Show. Galarian is persistently trying to kill you. Why not fight back with some persistent damage of your own? I like that. That was actually pretty good. Usually those ones kind of suck, but that was actually kind of clever.